Right, so we have our second past paper question, and in this one, the topic of focus is molecular transport, namely diffusion and osmosis. Right, so in this one, we have in part A, let me just read it out. Explain what happens to an animal when it is removed from the organism and placed into concentrated sucrose solution. Very important part of this whole thing is this part. It says explain what happens. So, explain is one of those higher level objectives. So, it would often include other lower level objectives. So, for example, in this case, to explain what happens, you also have to describe what happens, which is a lower level objective, and then, of course, then indicate what caused the thing that you're observing, right? So that's what we're doing here. In the first part, we are indicating what happened. In the concentrated sucrose solution, the animal cell shrinks, right? So that's your first mark. And then the second part, this is because water is moving out of the cell via osmosis. Make sure to include this into the sucrose solution where water is at a lower concentration. This is important because remember, if you're talking about movement via osmosis, you also want to show that the water is moving from high concentration to low concentration, right? So you want to indicate in some way that the water is moving towards a space or a region that has a lower concentration, right? And for B, same explain what happens, right? So you have to describe and then explain what happened, right? So first thing you indicate that in the distilled water, the animal cell bursts, right? And the cell cytoplasm more concentrated than the distilled water, so water moves into the cell via osmosis, expanding till it bursts, right? So this part, you don't have to include that. If you omitted it, that is fine. But again, you want to make sure that you indicate the process involved and you indicate that yes, there was a concentration gradient, that there was movement, that the water was moving from its high concentration to its lower concentration, right? And then for part C now, notice there's a slight difference. Now you have a comparison question because firstly, you just have to describe, and you have to describe how the results would be different from A and B. So that's a comparison question, meaning that you have to compare what would have happened in the plant cell versus what happened in the animal cell. So notice it's not explaining what happens, you're just describing the results. This part here, very important. You're describing the results. Because what might happen to a lot of people is that they see that and like, okay, well, I have to now once again explain it. No, just describe what happens to the plant cell and indicate how that is different from the animal cell because you are essentially answering a comparison question. So for the first part, for the concentrated sucrose solution, you indicate that well, the plant cell does not shrink as much as the animal cell. So that's one way of saying it. You could indicate that, or you could even say, unlike the animal cell, the plant cell doesn't shrink by any major amount, and therefore this is what happens instead, right? Due to the presence of the rigid cell wall, that is, it's preferable you have it, but if you don't have that particular part, that's okay because you're just describing the results, you're not explaining it. Okay, so you're going to just indicate, okay, this is what happened versus what happened with the animal cell and what happens instead. So instead, if enough water is lost, the cell membrane will tear away from the rigid cell wall. All right. So notice here, even in this part here, I'm already implying that this was the reason. So this isn't even, completely necessary. It's just extra explanation, right? And just an aside, I usually do it that way because my intention for these answer schemes and mark schemes is that it would also be a tool for revision. So even as I put my answer and a mark scheme, I'd also add additional notes just to, in context, to try to, trigger your brain to remember certain things and to make those connections for later on. Because you're not going to get the exact question like this, but the concepts and the understanding of how the marks are broken up would be applicable whatever question you get, right? So for the next part, it says in the distilled water, the plant cell does not burst like the animal cell. So again, it's a comparison. You're indicating, well, the animal cell does this, but the plant cell does not. Instead, what the plant cell does, instead it expands and becomes turgid. And here I just added as well that the cell wall prevents bursting, which is fine, right? And the main thing is that you're indicating that the plant cell doesn't burst. Instead, it becomes turgid, it expands and becomes turgid, right? And that's basically your three-part question, right? Straightforward to the point.